You've heard of high net worth, but we're talking about high net purpose. We want to find out how entrepreneurs, global leaders in our network are allocating financial, human, and intellectual capital in pursuit of purpose. But more importantly, we want to understand the compromises, the paradoxes in their approaches, pitch decks, and philosophies.
What does it take to rethink our food systems, address climate change, and transform how we nourish ourselves and our planet? Today, we sit down with food system investor Henry Dimbleby, a powerhouse who's redefined what it means to eat well and live sustainably. Having started off initially in journalism and then working at Bain, he then went on to co-found and exit the multi-million-pound food chain Leon. Henry went on to join government, designing game-changing policies from the school food plan to the national food strategy, which reshaped how governments and the public think about food and health. He's also authored with his wife the Sunday Times bestseller Ravenous, that delivers an unflinching look at the crisis within our global food system that is impacting public health and climate change. He's now turned investor, founding Bramble Partners, where Henry invests in and advises innovative food businesses working to fix our broken systems. In this episode, Henry explains the scale and impact of our food system and the opportunities within it. He also explains his philosophy on why the solutions need to be financially sustainable. He talks to the most investable themes and how he and his team are targeting them. If you're ready to discover bold solutions for a healthier, more sustainable future, this conversation is a must listen. This is the Henry Dimbleby episode. Welcome, Henry, to High Net Purpose.
It's great to be here, Joe.
You have a formidable history in food. You have got incredible insights on the food system and now big plans on how to invest profitably in food-related businesses for the betterment of the planet. But before we get into that, can we go back to the articulation of your purpose? Have you got one?
Well, so I was thinking about this and, listening to some of your other guests on this podcast. And I think that my purpose has changed throughout my life. And I think about your purpose as being, what do you want to achieve and what are you uniquely suited to do? And at the moment, with this kind of shift into the work I'm doing at the moment, it's about demonstrating that there is money to be made, serious money to be made in the transition from a broken food system to a better one. And why is that? I mean, I've kind of, as you said, I've seen the food system from many different angles, and I think there are different ways of creating change. There's campaigning, which I've done, trying to get government to change rules. I've been a government advisor. There's philanthropy, which is really about, there are a few things that philanthropy can do. It can be a sticking plaster. It can, while the system is broken, it can stop, it can create nature reserves. It can look after people who are getting sick. It can build capabilities. But in the end, largely, I think philanthropy is not sustainable because once the money goes in most areas, then the effect goes. And then kind of moving along the spectrum, you have impact capital. And this is kind of characterized as capital that seeks a lower return than red-blooded capital. And again, I think there are areas where that can be useful. So, for example, the charity that I founded and still chair, Chefs in Schools, we have a not-for-profit arm which takes revenue to improve the food in schools and the education in those schools, and hires chefs, trains chefs, moves away from processed food. But that is not because it's not attractive. Just there's no as soon as private sector markets go in and do that, the money's not there and they just lose their mojo. But that impact capital is not. It's not going to scale. You can't scale impact capital. You can scale government and you can scale business, but not impact capital. And so, the food system is $12 trillion. It's 12% of the global GDP. It's 30% of the global workforce. A third of people work in the food system. And if you are going to create a better system, the capital that is behind that 12 trillion is going to have to operate in a different way, in a way that doesn't harm us, that doesn't harm nature. It's estimated that there's about that $12 trillion every year does about $13 trillion of harm to nature and to health. So it's actually not a profitable sector. Where the capital, if you fully account for it, for the harms it does, is not actually giving a capital return at the moment. So if that's going to move, you have to prove that you can offer red-blooded returns. So that is now my purpose with the work that I'm doing at the moment, is to do that and thereby attract more capital in and accelerate the transition to a better food system.
So that purpose is that you're talking about the generation of profit, but your purpose behind generating that profit is that you want to see the transition work in a different way. Is that the underlying?
Yes. So, I mean, and this is why I talked about what I'm uniquely capable of doing. So if you think about the food system, it has now become, if you look at Glasgow COP, for example, which was theoretically the biodiversity COP, food wasn't anywhere at the Glasgow COP, it was on the fringes. And yet, food is by far the biggest thing destroying biodiversity. And I think only, 4 or 5 years on from that, we actually now, people are realizing the central role that food is playing in a lot of societal ill health and harm. So it's the bigger, if you care about health, think about food, because it's the biggest cause of avoidable ill health. If you care about biodiversity, you have to address food. If you care about water stress, water shortages, you have to address food. If you care about aquatic life, deforestation, it's all food. If you care about climate change, it's the second biggest cause of climate change. 20 to 30% of greenhouse gases come from the food system. And so I think now that this is being seen as the second big transition after energy and transport, and as important. And that is my mission, if you want. That's what I care deeply about. I stumbled upon it, and then once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. But my purpose is kind of what am I uniquely able to do? And I've kind of feel I've done my government bit now. That's what can scale, government and business. And now my purpose is to make that business bit work and to show that there is, there's money to be made out of this, and to try and attract more capital and accelerate that return through red-blooded capitalism.
And because it's well covered elsewhere, but when you left university, you became a commie chef for a while. So there's been this sort of love of food through all of this. I'm assuming that's still there.
Yeah.
Passion.
I think at university I studied physics and philosophy. So I've always kind of been quite left brain, right brain. And then I was a commie chef for a bit and a journalist. And then I became a consultant. And I think you think where you look at something from, where you stand when you look at something, changes your perception of it, whether that's kind of in an argument or a view across a valley or a system. And through that, so kind of from working as a commie chef, then going kind of to Bain consultancy, working in strategy and big business, becoming an entrepreneur with Leon, working in government, I kind of feel that journey has given me, this is again part of my purpose, part of why I think I'm kind of got some unique skills in this area. That gives me a perspective on the food system, which is quite unusual. Most people stay in their lane, and it's so interconnected that I believe that actually it's quite dangerous within the food system to become too specialized, because you then get hit by the truck that you didn't even realize there was a truck coming along from somewhere else. So I think that having that view, that expanded view, is really important.
So working in these different parts of the food industry, what have you figured out about how you can positively influence what's happening?
So I think the first thing, and I saw this at Leon, which is trying to do a good fast food chain, and then I saw it in droves in government. And during COVID, I helped set up the government response to COVID. How do we feed Britain, because we weren't clear in DEFRA that actually could you get the 25% of calories out of home into home, that were served out of homes into home. Could you get the food from city centres to out of the country? And we suspended competition law. We had these 8:30 morning meetings with all the senior people in the food chain online, saying, okay, what kind of screens are we going to put up in the supermarket, et cetera, et cetera. I saw the food system shift, both as an entrepreneur and then at scale during COVID. And the first thing that is just become completely apparent is that there are certain commercial realities that only government can change. So, in particular, the reason the food system's got so bad is that we have an appetite that evolved a long time ago, and it really likes food that makes us sick. And that's really powerful. This is an ancient appetite. It evolved before we separated from mud-living worms. And food companies, not because they're bad people, we called it the junk food cycle in the food strategy, they've hacked into that appetite. There's been an escalating feedback loop. They've marketed more and more of that food. They spent more money in R&D. We've eaten more, and we've become sick. And you talk to the CEOs of those companies, there is nothing they can do to change that. They are powerless to change that, because if they try and do something else, their sales go down, they get fired. So they're constantly trying to experiment. They're constantly trying to. They don't want to be doing it. And then just on the other side, and the other thing that's happening is on the environmental side is that it's just much more profitable to run a business mining nature, extract, and this is kind of in the climate. This is kind of climate, but with more complex. It's just much cheaper to make things that destroy nature, that destroy ecosystems, than it is. And so that requires government regulation. But then there are all sorts of other pressures on the system that they're going to lead to the change too.
Because in a lot of the lectures and stuff that I've heard you do give the bosses at the food companies a bit of a pass on this. And, and when you look at big oil and stuff, people tend to be like totally anti. Whereas you're like, we need to work with these people, and and you're almost saying it's not quite their fault. But
so I don't think a bad system beats a good person every time. And if you think that you can change the system just by getting cross with the CEOs of the companies, it's just incredibly naive. You've got to understand what it is that is driving the behaviors. I spoke to the CEO of one very famous UK food company, and he was like, I try and put salads on the shelves, and no one eats them. They all eat the sausage rolls. It's very hard. So I think that just saying you're bad people doesn't fix anything. I do get, I think that where people are being intentionally duplicitous or misleading, that is problematic. But that is a kind of
that is a lot of the marketing, right? So we'll see things marketed as a protein bar or as a nutritious cereal, and you take another look at it, it's full of sugar, and it's
but that again is because that is what sells. So that is, and within the law, they are, the Advertising Standards Agency will pick them up if they're not within the law. So that is my point. You have to look at the system, and if they don't do it, the other thing is, like, if you were to take out the current people, without the regulatory change, other people would come into that space.
Because when you wrote the National Food Strategy, you did talk a lot about how we need system solutions to this stuff. So we've covered how you've sort of said, that the impact stuff may not scale the way it needs to. You need profitable businesses. This also seems like another important part of what you're saying is that you need to work with lots of actors around this to try and get the change to take place.
Yes, I think there are kind of 6 big drivers of the change in the food system. I think of it as a kind of 40-year transition in 4 blocks of, 4 decades. It's going to be, and there's that famous thing about probably less will happen than we think in the short term, but the fundamental shift is going to be much, much greater than we think it is. there are kind of 6 things that are driving it. There's the regulation. You've got huge capital flows coming in that even when they're losing money, such as alternative proteins, they're changing our knowledge base. They're changing the system. You've got competition, consumer preferences. You've got tech. And I think there's some fascinating things that we don't know about the tech. And maybe we can talk about those. And then you've got climate change itself, which is forcing people to change the way they farm, irregardless of climate regulation, because it's too hot, too cold, there's not enough water, there's too much water. So all of those things are playing out together to create the change in the system. And I think one of the other thing is, when you're thinking about how that system will transition, is you have to realize that there was Donella Meadows, who was one of the great systems thinkers, had this wonderful line about complex systems. She said, you can't control them. It's quite hard to figure them out, but you can dance with them. So you can try and you can push on them and change them and see how they move. And I think the job of investors is to try and think about the potential pathways that those trends, those forces are going to have, and then critically think about what the investment opportunity areas are, because a lot of that isn't investable still, or maybe investable in the second decade. So you have to kind of think, okay, so right now, over the next 10 years, which is the investment horizon of a venture fund, where are those areas likely to be?
So before we get into the opportunities, in your excellent book, Ravenous, you cover a lot around junk food cycle, invisibility of nature, etc. But can you give us some markings that you look at today that show how bad a mess we're currently in terms of the food system?
Yes. So let's look for health at the UK. So the UK, the total cost of obesity every year, if you look at the cost of productivity to the NHS, is estimated at £98 billion. And that doesn't cover actually the way that they calculate that doesn't cover the cost of children as they grow up and become sick. It is by far the biggest cause of avoidable ill health. Under the last government, when Jeremy Hunt was Chancellor, he called me in because you will have heard of the 2.8 million people long-term out of work, which is the highest number that
in the UK today.
Which is the highest number we've ever had. And in Treasury, this isn't health, in Treasury, they had looked at them and they'd worked out that there were 4 kind of main causes of that. Diabetes, coronary heart disease, musculoskeletal problems, knees, backs, and mental health. And 3 of those are directly caused by food, and one of them is exacerbated by it. So this is Treasury. So with that in the UK, if you don't solve the health problem, you basically, what happens is you put more and more and more pressure on the NHS. That sucks in money from the rest of the economy, the rest of the government money spending, because you can't let the sacred NHS go down. And at the same time, we become less productive. So you basically end up being not only sick, but also impoverished. So it is, and if you look at like what they're looking at in health, that is, the food is huge focus. And you can't, there's no way, I mean, with Wes Streeting's reforms, there is no amount that you can increase the efficiency of the NHS that's going to be able to cope with the number of sick bodies that the food system is throwing at it. So that's on health. And then...
And that's replicated across the world, right?
And that's
US,
replicated across the world.
India.
India. Well, I mean, in India and parts of Africa and these developing nations, you're now getting these kind of dual problems. So at one end of the affluent spectrum, you've still got really serious problems of malnourishment. And then at the other end, you've got type 2 diabetes and obesity. So it's happening everywhere in the world. And I'm interested, we might come on to them, semaglutides.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, it's gone since it started going up in the 50s. Obesity came down in the States last year. And then on the environment.
So we're covering. So what you've covered there is the economic cost, and of course we've got the huge human suffering on the other side of it.
That's really important. So behind those numbers, there are hundreds of thousands of years lost, of healthy years lost, and that means people not spending time with their grandchildren, people not able to pick up their grandchildren, all the logistical complications, the worries of all that. So you're right to pick up the kind of human side of it all. When you know, behind those numbers, there's another story, human story. And then on the environmental side, we are still destroying nature at an incredible rate. The animals that we grow to eat, we slaughter about 90 billion animals globally every year. At any one time, they weigh twice as much as all the humans and 20 times as much as all the wild animals. And we have basically driven out nature. And what's frightening about that is you don't know where the tipping points will come. This is kind of essential natural capital, pollinators, all of that stuff. You don't know when that tipping point will come. So on the biodiversity side, we need to reverse that. And then on the carbon side,
in the book, you do. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, go.
You do cover the loss in terms of pre-agriculture, the amount of wild animals that we had versus today. It's
so even in the last since the 70s, when we really accelerated intensive agriculture, we've lost 50% of our farmland birds. We're still destroying nature.
So by weight today, we've got more cattle than people.
Yeah, twice by weight. Animals, as I said, twice as much as all the people, 20 times as much as all the wild animals. And 75% of global farmland is used to feed animals, which is quite an inefficient way of feeding ourselves. And then on the climate side, what's really interesting here is you hear people saying, agriculture in the UK is probably about 12% of our carbon footprint. Food in total is about 25%. And you hear people saying, it's only 12%. You will have heard this on your podcast. So it's only, even if you hear only 1%, you've got to think that's 1% is quite a lot.
Yeah.
But also, it's the only part of the economy that hasn't decarbonized, that's continued, that resolutely refused to decarbonize. And so what that means is by 2035, 2040, that 12% is projected to go to 50%. So if you go back to the COP when it wasn't there at all, and then Dubai, food was front and center. It's just the focus on food from a carbon and biodiversity point is just going to increase and increase, because actually we're doing something about the other parts of the economy.
And then we see the pressures from warming in certain parts of the planet as well, impacting the food supply.
So that was the most frightening chart that we saw in the whole of the 2 years that we were working on the food strategy. And there are a couple of versions. One was done by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and one was done by NASA. But they show the same thing, which is trying to play forward what might happen in a 1.5, 2 degrees climate scenario to crop yields worldwide. And what you see on a global map is the northern hemisphere is kind of colored green, which means increasing yields. Because actually, notwithstanding, if you look at this year's floods for farmers, it was bad. But actually, wheat yields have been increasing across the northern hemisphere because wheat likes carbon dioxide. It's food stock. It likes warmth. And so it's been increasing. But then the maize yields and rice yields in the equatorial zone in the southern hemisphere are yellow and red. They are projected to decline. And in some cases, it could be catastrophic. So the Mekong Delta, for example, if sea levels rise by a meter, half the Mekong Delta will be underwater. That's the biggest rice exporting area to the world. And so when we looked at that chart, that green in the northern hemisphere, read in the equatorial and southern zones, it looked like a microcosm of so many of the stories that we're hearing already. It looks like, starvation. It looks like wars of resource scarcity, and it looks like mass migration. So that is a very frightening future. And that, as I said, the climate change thing, obviously that creates a huge opportunity for innovation. It's fantastic that in this country we have we're now enabling people to do gene editing of crops, and it means that we can, part of the effort has it's always about mitigation and adaptation, and there's just a huge amount of work to be done preparing for the worst to create crops that can exist and be grown in those areas.
So this maps out as a huge problem to be solved, but is it investable? And particularly given that people have been through this before, and it's not so many years ago that people, as you mentioned, lost a lot of money on alternative meats and on vertical farming, etc. Is this area actually investable? And if so, where?
So yes, and increasingly so would be my answer. And I'll talk about where. I think it's really interesting that I kind of think about food 1.0.
Yeah.
So, and the two places where people lost money were alternative proteins and vertical farms. And I think they lost money on alternative proteins because they largely ignored a fundamental fact. It was not food system money. It was a lot of tech money. It was kind of the same people who'd invested in many cases in kind of climate technologies, wind farms, solar panels. And it's very hard to sell something as a foodstuff that tastes less good and is more expensive. And so the S curves were just nuts. Basically, what you saw was for the kind of plant-based alternatives, they penetrated the vegans and then they stopped because they were more expensive and tasted significantly less good, and people lost a lot of money. There are, interestingly, and I'll talk about the investment areas, that I think there are now, because that money has been spent, there are some quite interesting areas where it might get to a point where it tastes better and is cheaper. And then on the vertical farms, I think they just lost sight of what this was. They were, if you look at the valuations of those things, they were invested as if they were data tech businesses, but they weren't. They were farms. They were, yes, they were in a building, but they were asset heavy and low ROCE. They were infrastructure investments, not venture investments. And actually you're seeing now, you're seeing them being, the farms themselves being bought out of, being bought out of, businesses that have collapsed and operating, perfectly respectably, making a return, doing high value herbs and microgreens and things and making money. So
got it.
So that's 1.0.
Yeah.
I think they got it wrong. 2.0. And as I said, I think it's a complex system. It's shifting. What I say now will not be the case for the second decade. And, but I think if you look at where the opportunities are now, we think there are four kind of main areas for investment in for investment for anyone. One is primary production. Now, where are the areas where in primary production you're going to invest as a venture investor? Primary production is going to look in the future. There'll be a continuum. So there'll continue to be people who have very intensive farming, but who do that in a less harmful way. And then you'll have more nature-based, what people call regenerative farming, very trendy phrase at the moment, where you intentionally reduce the output of food and you increase the nature.
Okay, so steady on. So primary production, you're talking about
growing
farms
ingredients,
and fishing.
Farms, fishing.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay,
growing things that can be cooked into meals.
Yep.
And for the venture investor, the actual production facilities I've just mentioned, which might be farms, or they could be precision fermentation labs where they're fermenting proteins or fats or whatever, they're growing them from bacteria, or they could be vertical farms. For venture, a lot of that is going to be too asset heavy. We're not looking ourselves at that as a big area. There are some quite interesting pieces. So, for example, there's a very interesting business, Meatly, which is precision fermenting meat for pet food, which I think is which doesn't need to be differentiated. You don't need to make it look like the pets don't care if it looks like a steak or, so, and there's really high demand. So I think there are some where there might be venture, but primary production, I think, is largely so asset heavy that it's not, if it's venture, it's going to, some people are buying up huge tracts of land and then regenerating them, and then with the idea to sell them off.
And it also kind of feels like these are sort of a common, like, where is the IP? If you have a new regenerative farm methodology, how do you own it? How do you monetize it?
Yeah,
is that an issue as well, or
So then the question then is: are there services to either end of that spectrum where you can make money?
Yeah,
and clearly on the intensive side, the answer is yes. There's a huge cost bar that sits underneath those revenues. That's where most of the food is produced, and so biologicals, robots, measurement services to intensive farms. There's a huge potential there. The regenerative side is more tricky because it's quite fragmented, and therefore, it tends to be kind of smaller farms. They're getting more of their revenue from government grants, from leisure, from building ecotourism. But I think there are two kind of areas where you could make money there. One is there are people who are building brands on top of that kind of farming. So Wild Farmed, which is run by Andy Cato, the guy from Groove Armada, is an interesting example of someone trying to do that. So kind of becoming the Patagonia of food, branding food for life, And then the other area is there are people who are aggregating that fragmented, offering services in an aggregated way to that fragmented group. So, for example, there's a German business called Klim that takes money from the big players, so the FMCG companies, who are worried actually that the soil and the sustainability of their supply base is a risk for them in the long term, but they don't really know the farmers because they're all aggregated through a mill. Yeah, and so there's a business like Klim where you act as an intermediary, helping those. So you take money from one side and you help the farmers become regenerative. So I think those aggregation services are interesting. That's primary production. And
just finish up that. So the regenerative farming, you're hugely optimistic on what's happening there. A lot of the investability that's probably on the other side of farming, where there's so much to be done in terms of, as you said, testing, reporting,
exactly,
optimizing,
and that. So for example, China. I find it weird that this wasn't big news. So China announced that it was going to digitize a third of its farming by 2035 last year. That is just an enormous amount of money that's going to be going into tech, and those will be global businesses. There are some differences, like rice is different from et cetera, but fundamentally a lot of those could be global businesses. So I think that's exciting.
And the AI feeds into this as well, right?
Yeah, so there are, AI, you get a drone that can look at your wheat and it can work at, but they're better than the human eye now at spotting wheat rust or other diseases. You'll get the kind of the real extreme of it now, which is actually a meeting of the two things, is people are talking about kind of plant by plant care. So you literally have, you will be fertilizing, addressing disease on a micro level within a field using AI and robotics. Some people even think you'll be able to grow multiple crops. You'll have combine harvesters. So you'll be able to massively reduce your nitrogen use because you'll be able to plant crops in the same field. And then when you combine it, it'll be able to pick up and separate efficiently, et cetera, et cetera.
So huge drop in costs.
Yeah, huge
environmental impact and increasing yields.
Exactly.
Okay. Where are we going next?
So
that's
then the
primary production.
Yeah, so it's so if the food transition is fundamentally the food transition is a land and diet transition, and that's the land part.
Yeah.
Then there's the diet part, and the trends here are health and personalized health, which I know you've talked a lot about in the past. Trust. So Chris Van Tulleken's book on ultra-processed food, that really had, RFK in the States the trust in the big food companies is at an all-time low, and rebuilding trust. And then diversification. 6 crops, I think it is, provide us with 75% of our calories, and that's risky. So those are the trends. This is an area where we'll come back to the test. I think there's some fascinating things that we don't know, that we will know in the next 2 years, which will affect how these things develop. So you've got what is the impact of ultra-processed food? We do not know the extent to which ultra-processed food just makes us overeat, which we know it does, and we know why it does largely, and the extent to which it causes other problems. So in mice, we know that ultra-processed food can mess with our microbiome, that emulsifies thin the stomach lining, that it messes with your immune system, that it can cause diseases of immune stimulation. We know that it's really causes problems in mice, and it might well be that we look at all of these diseases that we know are rising in the world at the moment, gut cancers, autoimmune diseases, and it may be that it's UPF that's causing that. That's possible. That's one thing we don't know. The other thing we don't know is appetite suppressing drugs. So we know they're very effective. We know they don't. We know that you have to keep taking them. You put on weight faster when you stop taking them than you do for any other intervention. If you go to Weight Watchers and lose the same amount of weight, it'll take you 5 years to put it back on. Yeah. If you do the drugs, you put it back on in a year.
So it's a maintenance program rather than a solution.
And that makes it hugely expensive as well. So what we don't know with those drugs is, will they become mainstream or not? So there's one view that says they're going to be like SSRIs. 15% of us are on SSRIs at the moment, antidepressants.
Yeah.
They're going to be like, we're just going to drug this problem away. There's a huge range of drugs that are coming up. There are pills. There are,
yeah.
The obesity problem is going to go away. And
so this is we're talking about semi-glutides, the GLP-1 receptor.
The current ones, GLP-1 agonists, because they mimic the action of a hormone called GLP-1. There are ones now that are mimicking other hormones. Semaglutide, which is marketed as Wegovy and Ozempic, same drug, is just one of. Mounjaro is another one, is a different one, isn't semaglutide. That's kind of like the Prozac of these drugs. So I think we can definitely expect them to get better, and with low. If you look at the progression of antidepressants, they got better with lower side effects. But you see with antidepressants, even now, we're having a debate about when you first start taking them, do they increase the chance of suicide? So one view of the future says they're going to solve the obesity problem. Another view of the future says, as with every other drug that has ever been, it turns out to be not so good as you first thought. Someone said that I've seen a medic said to me the other day, all drugs go through the kind of, this could be interesting, phase 1, phase 2, this is going to solve all our problems, phase 3, I wouldn't give it to my dog.
Yeah.
So that's going to impact how this transition happens. And then the third thing is the degree to which AI enables us to understand these complex reactions between the soil and nutrient density and the stomach and the immune system and mental health. So there's a much more fluid, like as those things play out and we understand it, that will impact the where the money is to be invested. But I think 100% you're going to get, because I'm 90% certain, just back reading, that the gut biome is going to turn out to be hugely important. It's always the way. Like, it's when we thought there was just junk. Yeah. When we thought there was junk DNA.
Yeah.
90% of our DNA was junk. It was absolute bollocks. It was actually epigenetic. It was what was turning on and off all the other DNA, and it was So I think there'll be the opportunities here are in the gut biome. Those things,
and it's still early in some of those, but there's companies that are emerging at the moment, which will be
Simprove, for example, is the one gut biome improvement company that's proven to work. It stays alive. If someone doesn't kill it. So I think there'll be those. I think you will 100%. There'll be a move into personalized medicine that isn't snake oil.
Yeah.
So there's that's a big thing. And then I think trust. I think when you think about a big transition, you think, will it be like when you have a regime change or when you have a kind of revolution, will it be like England where you have the same kings, but you have a parliament, like you have the same rulers, or will the rulers get overthrown? And I think for some of I think it's not clear yet. So I think you might get trusted brands and companies that actually begin to seriously eat into the portfolios of some of those companies. It doesn't matter really, because either way, they'll either buy them, they can't make them, or they'll be taken out of the market. So I think that's very exciting. And then just very quickly,
but just to understand that you on the trust side, how is that investable? Is it that you're looking at new, more authentic, better brands that will disrupt the larger ones, or
so you're looking at kind of mentioned what is the Patagonia of food? Like there is the current brands and manufacturers have been fundamentally the trust in them has gone.
Yeah.
So people making unprocessed good food which doesn't destroy the environment, which tastes good critically, that I think there's an opportunity there. I'm not sure we would, that's not kind of one, that's a brand investment, very tough at the moment.
Yeah.
And then there are other things to support that. So ingredients businesses, clean ingredients, getting away from some of the ultra processed ingredients in the past. So, but diet, that diet shift, I think there's huge opportunity.
Circular economy, waste reduction.
There are two areas which are supporters or kind of enablers.
Yeah.
One is waste reduction and circular economy. There are some really exciting businesses that are taking food waste and getting it back into the food system.
Should we just talk a minute on food waste, how bad a problem that is, just to give a context?
Yeah, I mean, it's a third of the food that we grow to eat, we throw away. I was at a sandwich maker yesterday, and they had just been told, they were supplying supermarkets. They'd just been told by one supermarket that they wanted finger sandwiches, so with the crust cut off, and it was causing 3 tons of crust waste a week.
Which goes where?
Well, so the reason I was there is that there was a company that had it was going into anaerobic digestion, so just being turned into heat and gas and used for energy, and then the leftover being put on fields. But there was a company there that was trying to that had worked out how to turn it into crisps. So, and actually they weren't bad. So but then there are people doing much more fundamental things. So, for example, there's a company called Supplant that has worked out how to turn rice and maize leftover, so corn cobs and rice stalks, which are produced and thrown away and composted in vast quantities, into an oligosaccharide, into a form of sugar, which is lower calorie than normal sugar. So there are some really huge opportunities on that recycling on the food side, and then also obviously on the packaging side. So there's that, and then the other enabler is data and measurement. And here I think there's a direct connection between the government regulation and the size of the opportunity. So if it's $13 trillion of harm, and you believe that government needs to either, government can either, they can only really do 4 things. They can ban things, mandate things, they can fine you or tax you, and they can pay you or subsidize you. All of those things require the accurate measurement of $12 trillion of harms. And therefore, I think that the opportunity in measuring everything from, there are fascinating businesses now growing up measuring biodiversity, not only using satellites, but sound, measuring carbon in soil using seismology. That's the kind of primary data, but then all the way through the supply chain, you need to track and measure that. And I think that is just an opportunity that is probably several orders of magnitude above what people currently think it is.
So in looking at investing around food, earlier stage, growth stage, it sort of sounds like it could be a bit niche, but you've sort of highlighted that it is overwhelmingly large in terms of the problem set and then the potential opportunities.
Yeah, it is. And we're investing, from kind of Series A through to growth. So we think, again, if you think about that over time, there'll be more and more private equity opportunities. There'll be more and more later stage opportunities.
Yeah.
We think it's a bit, the stuff about the science. So there are people who are taking bets on UPF, semaglutide, what'll happen.
Yeah.
That's kind of seed, pre-seed. That's a bit hit and hope. So we're going for the Series A to growth, but we think that will increase massively over time. And it's 12% of the global economy, and it is not going to be operating in the same way in the future. So I think
UPF is ultra processed food.
Ultra processed food.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so one thing we haven't actually, we've included in the intro, but not mentioned it here, is that this next chapter for you is as an investor in earlier stages. You mentioned in Series A to growth.
Yeah.
But you don't wear a hoodie. You don't live in the valley. How are you fitting into the stylized view of what a venture capitalist should look like?
So I think that Bramble Partners, which we've set up, has two parts. It's got an advisory business and it's got an investing business. So Bramble Intelligence and Bramble Investments. Advisory business managing big corporates and governments on how to create the change. The investments, investing Series A to growth. Those two businesses together give us, and the networks that I have and I'm giving to the team, give us a view on this system that we think is unparalleled. We think no one else has that perspective. But they're run, and they are, the people doing the investing are, I've been lucky enough to be joined by some really fantastic investors. And, the intelligence side, the person running the intelligence business, a guy called Chris Mitchell, who founded BCG's food systems practice. So what I've realized in my later life, too late actually, is that you again, this comes back to purpose. You are uniquely good at quite a small number of things. But if you can solve problems with people, if you can get people in, you create a system in itself that can be hugely powerful. So the edge is the knowledge and the networks, but then clearly there's a pattern recognition that you get from having done deals for 25 years. I've been on the other side of it as an entrepreneur. I did commercial due diligence at Bain and private equity, but just you want to have people who have that pattern recognition of a very specific.
I was slightly teasing our best investments in venture typically being where the manager was previously an operator themselves.
Well, I think definitely that. So what I noticed, entrepreneurs, they lock themselves away and drink whiskey late at night with each other and complain about their investors. And the one I do think when you get a really good investor, I sometimes think the investor actually even more important to the success of a business is the investor than the team. And if you get it wrong, and in particular, I think the way it goes wrong is investors who've never operated a business behave in the wrong way. So they back off and go and look after other things when the business is doing well, which is actually when you should be really piling on the pressure, because that is when you have the opportunity to accelerate, really to break free. And then when the shit hits the fan, when it's trouble, they get angsty and they come in and they are dysfunctional in board meetings and they try and put the pressure on, and actually, the entrepreneur has got more in the game than you have. They know what's going on. And at that point, you need a board and investors who are supportive, helpful, coming with solutions. So I do think that, I was slightly flippant that I'll be delegating that to people who know better than me. I do think that being an entrepreneur and having been an operator does give you an edge in terms of, it's the value that's created in businesses is not linear. They bump along and they have normally a lot of tough times, and then they'll have a bit of a good time, and then it'll get tough, and then hopefully you get to that point where they go through a 2-year phase and their valuation in that 2 phase goes up by 10 times, and that's the point when you exit. So I think having experience of that is quite important.
So being a global expert on food systems and having been in all different parts of it, having been an entrepreneur yourself, a very successful one, what else do you think as an investor you can bring to those entrepreneurs who are trying to build their businesses? So you described there quite eloquently how sometimes you need to, lean in, other times give them more space. What else do you think you can do as an investor?
So I think that the above and beyond that kind of, Omar Habal, who's my business partner, and this is also a serial entrepreneur, and just like that kind of entrepreneurial support. Other than that, I think the best thing, if I supported before setting up Bramble quite a lot of food businesses, and it's making those. It's the fact that we know, oh, you should meet this person in this supermarket because they could buy this, and you can very quickly introduce them. Yeah. And suddenly, I've done that. Just friend, and I'll get an email back a year later saying, by the way, that made our business. So that's those introductions, that network. That regulatory understanding, we've got businesses who are coming from Australia to set up in the UK and are kind of trying to get their head around regulation, and we know all the right people in government to introduce them to. So I think that's the thing that we have that other firms don't have, is that it's that network and understanding the food system. I mean, there are things, if you have a bunch of VCs who've left their current VC firm to set up their own thing because they want more carry or whatever, they will have things that we don't have. I've tried very consciously to build a team that looks a bit different, and we hope that will give us an edge.
So you're still a young man, about the same age, so we're not that. How do you maintain the energy levels that you have yourself?
So I just think it's really. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm a bit like Obelix. I was dropped in the energy cauldron at birth, so I do have quite a strong engine, and I think that's just luck. And then it's just the real basics. I eat well, and I love cooking, and I love kind of we have as much as we can. We have family. I've got 3 kids, 17, 14, and 12, and we probably eat together 3 times a week, 4 times a week.
Yeah.
I cook them breakfast every morning. I do the early shift. I get up at 6 and cook them breakfast, which I love doing. So eat well, exercise, get outside, get in nature, and create a community, meet friends. I mean, I just think those are the 3 things: food, exercise, and community are the 3 things that keep anyone. And if you're feeling de-energized or glum, ask yourself whether one of those 3 things is missing. It's almost always the case.
Last question: what advice would you give to a young Henry?
I am a young Henry.
You know what I mean. So maybe Henry, who was at Oxford playing cards late at night and trying to not thinking about the future. What if you had a chance to have a chat with him? What would you say?
Buy Bitcoin. So I would say a bit later, Henry. So the first version, Entrepreneur, the beginning of Leon, and we talked a little bit about this, but you trying to be kind of all things to all people, and trying to solve any problem, thinking you're super clever and therefore you can solve any problems from first principles, and just I'd say solve problems with people. If you've got a problem, just ask yourself, are you really the person? Are you the only person who can solve this problem?
Thank you very much for taking the time with us today. Best of luck with Bramble, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you.
All content on High Net Purpose is provided as general information only. It does not constitute any advice, recommendation, or representations, and is not intended to influence listeners or users into making any specific investments or any other decisions. Please be aware that guests and presenters on High Net Purpose may have investments in any of the topics or products being discussed. Their reviews and opinions are their own and should not be taken as endorsements or financial advice. Before making financial decisions, we strongly recommend seeking advice from a qualified financial professional. This podcast may not be copied, reproduced, further distributed, or published in whole or part.